Hello, everyone. Let's get started. We are just a few minutes after 5. Actually, we are 5 o'clock on time. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Simone Severini. I'm the VP of Revenue at Modulos. So today we are going to talk about EU AI Act, so the European AI Act and its impact on the AI industry. Our speaker today is our CEO and co-founder, Kevin Shavinsky, who's ready to take us through a few slides and a short platform demo. So before going with the presentation, I'm going to remind you that you can comment by emailing us at contact@modulos.ai or using the LinkedIn chat for the event that I will constantly monitor. So send your questions there and we will address them towards the end of the presentation. So thank you very much. And Kevin, the stage is all yours.
Thanks so much for the fantastic intro, Simone, and welcome all to our webinar this Monday. And as Simone said, our topic today is the EU AI Act, and in particular the fact that it is here, that it is basically here. It's in the very final stages of negotiations, and it's going to have a really big impact on how AI will work in Europe and around the world. So our webinar is going to address the following questions. What is actually in the EU AI Act? What do you need to do to get ready? Some recent interesting developments by the Spanish government to get ahead of the curve here. And then I'll show you a short platform demo. I'm not going to do a full use case or anything. I'll just show you how, in the case of a credit decision, you can use our platform to make it fairer in line with what the EU AI Act is going to demand. So you see here a short screenshot of the EU AI Act. It's been in the works for quite a few years, and over the last year or so, the movement to get this into legislation has gained momentum, and we're now in the very final stages. And so I'll start right here with a huge caveat emptor that the EU AI Act is still subject to last-minute negotiations. In fact, over the last few weeks, we saw some major changes to it that are going to have wide impact that I'll point out along the way. And so until the act has actually passed the EU Parliament, we might still have some surprises of this nature. So what is the EU AI Act? The AI Act, you can think of it as the GDPR for AI. The EU is now known as the regulation superpower, meaning that whatever rules the EU decides on for its domestic market become the de facto global standard for the world. So when Europe decided to introduce its GDPR, not only did European businesses and European websites have to comply to it, but also more or less de facto websites and businesses from around the world also had to implement GDPR standards. In fact, you then saw other countries adopting laws and regulations similar to GDPR, such as in California, for example, again, setting the de facto standard for the United States. The EU AI Act represents a big move away from voluntary guidelines, best practices, codes of conduct for ethical and trustworthy AI to law. So no longer is trustworthy AI something to aspire to, that is a nice to have. The EU is going to require your AI-based products and services to conform. The penalties are incredibly stiff. The Act envisions that violations will have penalties of up to 6% of global turnover. So those are huge fines, larger fines even than GDPR. And there was a provision that the minimum fine should be 30 million euros until it was realized that that would put any SME in Europe out of business. The EU AI Act also doesn't stand on its own, but it's a part of a suite of legislation that Europe is pushing as part of its move to regulate the digital space. The other major pieces of legislation are the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and the recently passed AI Liability Directive. That directive outlines how individuals who feel wronged by an AI system may go ahead and take legal action in Europe against companies who they feel have violated their rights. One of the most important aspects of the EU AI Act is that it introduces a risk-based classification scheme. goes all the way from minimal to no risk to unacceptable risks. So there are actually some AI applications that the EU has decided will not be permitted at all. In between those two ends are the high risk applications and the AI with specific transparency obligations. So if you're interacting with a chatbot, the EU is going to make it obligatory that you reveal that you're not speaking to a human. Now, the part of the classification that is most important is the high risk classification. This is use case based. So the EU has published and edited a list of types of use case that it considers high risk. These are left relatively vague. They go from the explicit to the vague. And the EU Commission has demanded an explicit right to add, change, or amend that risk-based classification list. So whatever's in the act itself is simply the starting point as the Commission decides that other areas or use cases need to be added. Particularly affected by these risk-based classifications is most things that financial services do. Right from the start, decisions on credit were included in high risk. But just, I believe, 2 weeks ago, the negotiations with the Czech EU presidency resulted in adding explicitly all of life and health insurance explicitly as a high-risk application. Now, just because your particular AI product and service is not on that high-risk list doesn't mean you're safe. There are other criteria in the Act that basically boil down to if your AI system has a big impact on a citizen's life and life chances, then your system is going to be considered high risk. What does it mean to conform to these new regulations? There's a wide number of things. I'll just highlight a few of the things here. And if you're an AI ML practitioner, you'll find some of them very interesting and some of them almost a step back from that ambition to scale and automate all of AI. So the first thing is that the EU is going to demand that whatever data you use to train your system has to be high quality, and you're going to have a data governance in place. It's an interesting change because the original draft of the EU AI Act actually said that your data has to be free of error, which led to some interesting laughs by the data practitioners. But this has now been changed to something to the effect of as free of error as possible. So you're going to have to show that you did your best to go from whatever raw data you had from the business to the highest quality data possible that you're going to build your AI system on. It also explicitly requires that your training data is representative of the populations that you want to cover. So this particular part has been left as representative, but what they really envision here, and all the supporting documents show this, is that as the law is turned into regulations and there's going to be implementations in different EU member states, that the national concepts of fairness and non-discrimination are going to be baked into your AI system. So you're going to have to show that your AI product and service doesn't discriminate according to the regulatory regime and the legal regime in the country in which it operates. What's also essential is that the AI system is going to have human oversight. They went back and forth with exactly how this should be phrased. Is it human oversight? Is it human in the loop? Is it human in command? But you're not going to be able to get away with a high-risk system that is fully automated and just retrains based on certain triggers. It's going to be after a human in the loop and giving his or her blessing to what the system is doing. And finally, the EU is very keen on robustness and cybersecurity. So the concept of robustness is vague. It can go from a very narrow technical definition of getting warnings when you're predicting out a sample, all the way to what if there's a new COVID epidemic? So it remains to be interesting to see how the EU is going to interpret this concept of robustness, and also how it's going to view cybersecurity as a requirement. And we have to wait and see how these general requirements are going to be turned into regulations. Now, the EU AI Act has teeth. So again, this is subject to ongoing negotiations, but any high-risk system has to be ready for audit and inspection. And just, I believe last week, the EU added a power for the new national authorities that regulate AI to do unannounced on-site and remote inspections of the high-risk AI systems. And so you have to be ready for an audit at a moment's notice. And so, again, these national authorities likely are going to be responsible for incorporating these legal concepts, such as fairness, into the more technical requirements that practitioners will have to implement. So what are you going to have to do to get ready? It's a big transformation task. And the first question you should ask yourself is, are your products and services right now actually or potentially considered high risk? If you think they might be, you're going to have to get ready. And you should consider doing a gap analysis between your current state of your AI products and services and how you built them, and these new requirements. So this might include a data quality audit, data AI fairness audit, and updating and replacing AI ML infrastructure to get ready. Now, this is a process that's not going to work overnight. So even with any grace period that the EU AI Act is going to grant, this is a journey you should start on now, not the day before these regulations go into effect. And one thing to consider, and we've already heard some cases of this, is that even if you're not in the high risk category, that auditors and insurance providers might change their requirement and say, we're only going to insure you, we're going to have insurance coverage if your AI product and service is conforming to those high risk requirements in order to limit the risk from their side. So there's a global perspective here. So as I mentioned earlier, the EU AI Act has global reach, but other countries are catching up and starting to copy. And I would particularly call out here the US AI Bill of Rights, which was just published by the White House. This document is, if you want, a pendant to the EU AI Act, geared towards American concepts of discrimination and bias. But as a proposal by the White House, it doesn't have the force of law. And there doesn't seem to be any immediate prospect that this will become federal law through Congress. What's instead happening in the United States is that local and state laws are instead picking and choosing from aspects of the AI Bill of Rights, but more particular, the EU AI Act, and implement them locally. So New York City, for example, just regulated all automated decision systems dealing with people's data in employment situations. And starting January 1st next year, it's going to be a heavily regulated activity, putting the responsibility for these systems on any company that uses them. Closer to home, in Spain, the Spanish government is really taking charge of getting the Spanish economy and Spanish business ready for the EU AI Act. They already amended public law to add the use of AI in public discrimination. And they already stated that they're going to have to implement applications of AI to Spanish non-discrimination law. And they're going to include in these amendments criteria to minimize bias, offer transparency, interpretability, and accountability. And they're already envisioning the creation of a quality seal for AI products and services offered by Spanish businesses. They've already created, they're envisioning creating an AI sandbox with support from Brussels, so the Spanish business can get started trying out whether their current services actually meet any of these requirements, and are urging business in Spain to get ready now, not wait until the regulations go into effect and then it's too late. So with that, I just want to give you a very, very short overview of how we might address such a fairness use case using our platform. So what we've done here on our platform, we've built a credit decision system, basically taking historical data of credit decisions and trying to figure out whether a new applicant should be given a personal loan. And this data included both financial history data, but also personal data such as personal financial information, gender, marital status, etc. So sensitive attributes, sensitive information. And we built an AI model here automatically using our platform, using our AutoML, that would accurately predict whether somebody was likely to repay the loan or not. When we put this model on a dashboard, we saw that the accuracy of this model reached a certain level. But a measure of fairness here, the so-called equalized odds conditioned on gender, was really, really bad. So this model was accurate, but it was very discriminatory and was discriminatory particularly against women. I'll tell you a bit more about how we resolve that. Our approach, a data-centric approach to AI, means that we go into the data, figure out what the sources of error, noise, and bias are, so that when we retrain at the next step, we reduce the equalized odds bias and essentially move it towards 0. And so here we have not just a model that we've optimized for both accuracy and fairness, we also have that audit trail to explain what we did to get this model and the data that supports it into shape. Now, how did we do this? We used our unique technology to figure out what the individual contribution of each data sample was to a measure of fairness. And so here in the tail on the left-hand side selected, I can actually move this around and select different data samples. We find those samples which were most responsible for this lack of fairness in the model. And we go and look at maybe what do we learn about those samples. We find that in general, that the people who contributed to that were younger. And if we go further into the metrics, we find that they were actually assigned the wrong result, that they should have maybe not gotten the loan when they did, or the other way around. And in particular, whether the person was male or female and whether they were married, those were incredibly high factors in being responsible for lack of fairness. So what we can actually do with that information in hand, we can improve our processes. We can go back and understand why those loans were incorrectly given. And we can also then go into our data and edit the data and clean it and curate it to produce a better version of this data set that's more representative, that has fewer errors, and build the next version of our model, which we then eventually can decide whether we want to ship or not. So with that, I'm at the end of my presentation and the presentation in this webinar. And I would now like to encourage you to ask questions in the chat or visit our website, or if you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at contact@modulos.ai, and Simona and I are going to hang out in the chat here and try to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Hey, Kevin, there is already a question here. So Bilal is asking, why not to take the data attribute out altogether, and I mean by data attribute the gender, while training for fairness?
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about saying you have a data set, and one of the columns in the data set is the person male or female or other. And why can't you just take that column out and say, I won't even consider that information? So there's a simple reason for that, because gender bias will be reflected not just in the gender column, but in the other data in your data set. So for example, if you have marital status, number of children, income, whatever data you have in the rest of your data set, it's going to have that information about gender encoded in it. So if you just remove the gender column, you're doing actually the worst thing that's possible, which is that you're blinding yourself to the information you need to even tell whether your model is fair or not. So that data needs to stay there, and you need to do a lot more work on the data in order to get it to a state where it is fair and representative. So I would really recommend against doing that.
Very good. So let's wait a couple of seconds more in case there are other questions here coming in. I know there is a little bit of delay, temporal delay here. If not, one of the things that you, Kevin, already mentioned is that you can reach us throughout also on this LinkedIn chat after the event, or at contact@modulos.ai. And you know, we are welcome. You're welcome, and we would like to provide those answers to you. So there is a comment from Dorothea. So it says, nice explanation, Kevin. It's called fairness through awareness, if I remember correctly, right? That's one comment. And then, yeah, also Elena from our team is fully available and is our financial services expert, capable of answering technical questions in the financial domain. Having said this, I would say we close here, and looking forward to receive your questions offline. Thank you very much for making the time on Modulos behalf.